Alright, moving on about the New Testament. The New Testament includes texts written about between 50 and 150 CE. It's probably more likely 50 to 120, but just to be on the safe side, let's call it 50 to 150. Jesus was born roughly around the year 0. He died probably around the year 30. And the earliest writings that we have were written probably 20 years after Jesus died. And they were written from 50 all the way up into 120 or 150 CE. So scholars are not sure when the Gospel of John, for instance, was written. Most people guess around 120. That means it was written about 90 years after Jesus died. There's a big gap between when Jesus died and when this text about him was written. Canon was finalized around the end of the 4th century. Again, when I say the canon, that means when they got together and said, this is the official anthology. That didn't happen until the end of the 4th century. Before that, people just had collections of different writings. They had a bunch of letters, a bunch of apocalypses, a bunch of gospels, a bunch of Acts, for instance. And different Christian groups held different ones authoritative. What happened was that there was this guy named Marcion who came forward and said, you know what, I think that we should only include these, like, he had a really, really short list of, like, I think 7 or 8 texts. He said only these should be accounted as canonical or as authoritative or as a part of our anthology. And that created a backlash. The biggest group of Christians at the time responded by saying, no, that's too narrow. There should be more than 7 or 8 sacred scriptures to us. So they looked at all the texts out there, all the ones in the that they could possibly include in their anthology, and they chose 27. So there are 27 texts in the New Testament. Now that didn't happen all at once. That happened over a period of time, and there were a bunch of different anthologies proposed by different people. So there's, you know, some anthologies with 25 books proposed, some with 30, some with 35, some with like 2. I'm making up these numbers, but you get the idea. There were different anthologies proposed. The one that we have now with 27 books is basically the one that won. It's the one that was most persuasive to the most number of people in the first few centuries. So, just to conclude here before moving on from the New Testament, there were massive amounts of early Christian literature not included in the canon or in the anthology, including the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas. These are just a few, for instance. The Gospel of Peter, we're going to actually look at selections from early in the course. What languages was the Bible, or what languages were the Bible written in? The Jewish scriptures, or the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, were primarily in Hebrew, almost exclusively in ancient Hebrew. Apocryphal books, or the deuterocanonical books, the ones that are only sacred to the Roman Catholics. Remember, Jews don't view them as authoritative, and Protestants don't view them as authoritative. Only the Roman Catholics. Those books are written in Hebrew, in Aramaic, and Greek. The New Testament, primarily Greek, basically exclusively Greek. You should know this. Hebrew scriptures are written in Hebrew. That should be no surprise. Apocryphal or deuterocanonical books, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and then the New Testament in Greek only. Let's move on to talk about the copying. So once these texts were written, how do we get them? Well, at the very least, you should know that they were originally written in scrolls. Scrolls are, you know what a scroll looks like. It rolls out, you got 2 pieces of wood and stuff rolled up around it. These were difficult to access. The reason why they're difficult to access is because if you want to find a passage in the middle, you've got to unroll half of the book before you can find it. So they were bulky, they were cumbersome, and it was probably for reasons like that that eventually they went on to writing things in codexes. The word codex is just technically the word for book in Greek. Codexes are what we call a book, where there's a binding on the end and pages are sewn together on the end. The reason why this is better than a scroll from a technical standpoint, again, if I want to open up to the middle of this, I can do that in no time at all. I just go dink, Right there, I'm in the middle. If I had a scroll, that would take me like a half hour to roll out. There are no originals of any of these texts that were eventually included in the New Testament. So, take the Gospel of Mark. We have no originals of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Matthew. We have no originals of the Gospel of Matthew. Any text in the whole Bible, we do not have originals of any of them. What we have are copies of copies of copies. Scribes had a job of copying these texts. Now what that means is that, once they started building churches, imagine a guy sitting in the basement of the church. He's got a text over here and he's got a blank sheet of paper over here, and it's his job to read from there and just copy it over by hand. That was done over and over and over and over again by scribes. They would just copy, copy, copy. The reason why we have copies of these texts now is because those scribes produced those copies. Now, just as an aside, what is in your Bible? Now, let me go grab a Bible so I can do this accurately.